top 20 reading specialist interview questions and answers. A reading specialist, just like the name suggests, is charged with planning, teaching, and evaluating instructions for learners experiencing difficulty in reading. This article will focus on some of the most common interview questions for this post if you have applied for a related post. 1. Why are you interested in this role? By now, you should know some of the most common questions in an interview room. The interviewer is deducing your motives and whether you will make a good fit for the company. Tip number 1, do not be selfish. Ensure that your answer also touches on the company. Tip number 2, your answer should be honest and genuine. Sample answer: I believe that I have the experience to propel your institution to greater heights. Your institution's core values resonate with my values, and I believe that I can make a good team member. 2. What are the roles of a reading specialist? Do you understand some of your responsibilities? Kindly tell the interviewer. Sample answer: a reading specialist plans, teaches and evaluates instructions for learners who have a reading challenge. She works with learners in small groups and classroom settings. 3. What are the qualities that a reading specialist should have to be effective? Do you know what you need to have to be the right reading specialist? That is what the interviewer would like to know. Tip number 1, mention qualities that resonate with your job. Tip number 2, you do not have to be too detailed. Sample answer: a reading specialist should believe in her learners. He should also be reflective about their teaching and be able to develop good relationships with the students and other employees. 4. What major challenge did you face during your last role, and how did you overcome it? This question should convince you that the interviewer is assessing your problem-solving skills. Tip number 1, talk about a given experience. Tip number 2, your answer should sound genuine. Sample answer: my biggest challenge during my last role was the lack of communication from the superiors. I did not want that to hinder my operation, and therefore, I decided to be making inquiries every day the moment I reported to work to avoid inconveniences. 5. Describe your daily routine as a reading specialist. The interviewer wants to talk about what you do while at work in detail. Tip number 1, do not talk about non-work related activities. Tip number 2, do not throw yourself under the bus with some answers. Sample answer: I report to work and get on with my daily classes and sessions. I attend to the group of students, usually made of 4 to 6 students, and assess their progress. I also walk to classrooms and randomly pick up the kids I need and evaluate them in my reading lab. I then prepare homework and reading materials for the students and give them homework. 6. Describe briefly about your experience. The interviewer is trying to know where you have worked and some of the valuable additions you have made in your career. Tip number 1, do not narrate your entire life. Tip number 2, only talk of experiences related to the job. Sample answer: upon leaving college, I was employed by the Higgins Elementary School as a junior reading specialist. I worked hard, and by the end of the year, all the students who had a reading problem could read. I then got a promotion as the senior-most reading specialist, and my duty was to supervise the other 2. I then left the school for Griffith School, where I have been the lead teaching specialist for the last 5 years. 7. What kind of strategies and mindset is needed for this job? Every job requires unique strategies and mindsets for success. Therefore, take some time and answer this question wisely. Tip number 1, talk about a strategy that has always helped you as a teaching specialist. Tip number 2, your mindset should be positive. Sample answer: being a reading specialist requires an optimist. Reading is an essential skill that can, at times, be hard to teach. Therefore, a reading specialist needs to be result-oriented. The best strategy that works in this role is working with groups and attending to the students individually. 8. What is the biggest challenge that you foresee in this job? This is the question that will tell the interviewer if you are fit for the job at hand. Tip number 1, tell the interviewer that you love challenges. Tip number 2, you can be honest if you feel something will be a challenge. Sample answer: I haven't identified a significant challenge that may prove difficult in this institution, but I believe that every job place has its fair share of problems. However, I love challenges and derive joy in overcoming them. 9. How do you stay motivated at work? This is a valid question. The interviewer wants to know what drives you despite your personal and job challenges. Tip number 1, do not mention material items like cash. Tip number 2, your motivation should be personal. Sample answer: I love seeing people at their best. Every time I come to work and see progress from my students, I feel happy. This gives me the drive to go on with my day-to-day activities. I also love beating deadlines. 10. Describe a time that you failed in this role and the lesson you learned. The interviewer wants to know some of the lessons you have learned in your career. Tip number 1, give an experience. Tip number 2, you can take the blame but do not throw yourself under the bus. Sample answer: I once decided to dismantle the groups that I had formed and taught the students all at once. After a month, I realized that most of them had not made progress and were worsening. I realized that I had failed and went back to the grouping method of learning. I learned that effective teaching requires group work, and I haven't looked back ever since. 11. How do you plan to work with your students and your colleagues? The interviewer is testing your level of involvement in your work. She also wants to know if you can get along with other colleagues. Tip number 1, this answer depends on the number of students. Tip number 2, your answer needs to be assuring. Sample answer: I prefer direct intervention in the classroom and dealing with each student personally. I wouldn't want to stay out of touch with my students and my purpose of being here. I will also instruct the teachers and other assistants to do a proper intervention in the classes to help the learners. 12. How does reporting and monitoring help in your job? Every job has its needs. As a reading specialist, you are required to monitor your students and make reports. The interviewer wants to know whether you know the essence. Tip number 1, explain how reporting is essential to your operations. Tip number 2, engage the interviewer on why you believe monitoring is an essential part of your operations. Sample answer: by screening learners, I can identify their problems and set goals according to their abilities and limitations. I will then monitor the learners to check on their progress. This helps me know where each of them stands and what needs to be done. I then prepare reports that I can easily share with other professionals working with the learners. 13. Has technology made your work more comfortable? How? Technology has taken the world by a storm and is present in all spheres. Employers want employees who are technologically able to adapt to changing times. Tip number 1, explain how technology has helped you in your course of operation. Tip number 2, your answer should be positive. Sample answer: technology has indeed made my work easier. There are software programs and mobile apps that I use, which help learners with their reading skills. Most learners also enjoy working with apps or playing educational games. 14. Do you have any expectations of your fellow job place? The interviewer wants to know what you expect of the administrator, colleagues, and other specialists you will be working with. Make sure that you think through the question. Tip number 1, you can be wise and turn the question around. Tip number 2, do not have wild expectations. Sample answer: I'd start by saying that I expect a lot from one person, only me. I want to do an excellent job and leave my learners well taught. I wouldn't have high expectations of my fellow employees, given that we will all be evaluated differently, but I expect their cooperation and open feedback. 15. How do you plan to identify learners with reading challenges? The interviewer wants to know whether you are skilled in your area of expertise. Tip number 1, you can suggest different methods of spotting learners with a reading problem. Tip number 2, show the interviewer that no learner will be left behind. Sample answer: I will conduct a short screening for word identification fluency, letter knowledge, and phonological awareness to separate them into 2 categories. I will then perform another individual screening on the students in the 2 classes. This second screening ensures that no student is left behind. 16. Could you please tell us an experience where you dealt with a problematic learner successfully? A reading specialist is expected to be empathetic of the learner's plight. This question is testing whether you have enough patience for stubborn learners. Tip number 1, portray empathy. Part number 2, capture the part where you dealt with the learner. Sample answer: I once had a student who never did any homework. He was also the weakest in the class but didn't cooperate. Instead of reporting him to the administrator, I summoned him and tried to determine the problem. I was then able to come up with a routine that worked for him, and in no time, he was one of the best students. 17. What do you know about us? You are expected to have researched before applying for the job. Every company wants an employee who understands their operation or knows something about them. Tip number 1, you can talk about the most recent news stories touching on the workplace. Tip number 2, you do not have to share a lot. Sample answer: I know that you have produced some of the best learners in the country. You pride yourself in quality and efficiency, which is captured in your motto. 18. Why do you want to work for us? This is a common question. The interviewer wants to know why you considered their office out of thousands of institutions. She is deducing your intentions. Tip number 1, be honest. Tip number 2, mention something in the company culture that motivates you. Sample answer: I love helping people achieve their potential, and that's the same thing that this institution does. I love your employee culture, which is highly accommodating. 19. What is your biggest weakness? This question does not have to look like a trap, even though it appears challenging. However, approach it carefully. Tip number 1, do not lie by saying that you do not have one. Tip number 2, do not let your honesty throw you under the bus. Sample answer: I sometimes get sidetracked by small details. However, I do not let this affect my operations since I have made it a norm to list out everything that needs to be done, however small. 20. Do you love working alone or on a team? Being a reading specialist means that you will be working alongside other professionals. The interviewer wants to know whether you are a team worker. Tip number 1, say that you are a team worker. Tip number 2, convince the interviewer that you can work with others. Sample answer: I love working with a team. I also enjoy working out zero knee, just that it does not give me as much joy as working with other employees. I have, over the years, developed several interpersonal skills that help me deal with others. Conclusion: you do not have to stutter when you attend a reading specialist interview. Make sure that you go through some of the questions that we have highlighted and think through.